Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you for braving the weather outside and the traffic from the Christmas tree lighting at the White House. It's obvious that you are very much compelled to be here by the topic and by the presenters, and that's exciting to me. I'm Sudip Parikh. I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Executive Officer of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, and I get to be the executive publisher of Science and the Science family of journals. That is a remarkable privilege. I want to thank you all for joining us for the 2022 Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Lecture. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this building, to welcome you to the lecture, and to welcome our honoree and lecturer, Dr. Douglas Landis, our distinguished moderator, Dr. Fred Gould, and esteemed panelists, Dr. Stephen Bradbury, Dr. Megan Fritz, and Dr. Linda Kinkel. AAAS, for those of you who don't know, is the world's largest multidisciplinary general scientific society. We're also a leading publisher of scientific journals, of cutting-edge research. We've been doing that for 175 years. And AAAS's mission is to advance science and serve society. And for all of you who have fretted over the last few years, I want you to step back for a second and realize that we are living in an absolute golden age of science. If you take a moment and you say, when has the world been able to understand its place in the universe in a way that we do today, through things like the James Webb Space Telescope, through the fact that we can hear gravitational waves across billions of light years, we can hear black holes running into each other, to the fact that we are on the verge of curing diseases. Curing. We never used to talk about that in science. We used to talk about treating, but there are people right now walking around in Mississippi who are cured of sickle cell anemia because of gene editing. They haven't needed a blood transfusion since the therapy. We are living in a time when the world has the capability of feeding 7 billion humans on this planet. Or is it 8 billion now? I think it just changed. 8 billion humans on this planet. That's remarkable. We live in remarkable times. Absolutely remarkable times. And I think we forget that sometimes, but these are absolutely the golden age of science and research and what it's able to accomplish for humanity. But we also live in perilous times. We live in a time when all of the foundation that's built upon sometimes seems to be shaken under our feet. Sometimes seems to be shaken under our feet. And there are existential challenges that we face as humanity. Things like climate change. Things like food insecurity, water insecurity, the need for electricity and energy storage systems. And all those challenges, science is going to be essential to addressing those challenges, every one of them. It's not the only component. There's policy, there's politics, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. But science is going to be integral to solving each of those challenges. And so the theme of today's program is designing pest suppressive agricultural landscapes for a changing world. Well, this fits right into those existential challenges. If we're going to feed 8 billion people, if we're going to do it in a way that doesn't hurt the planet on which we live, we've got to design pest suppressive agricultural landscapes for a changing world. Now, in 2021, there were expectations that food security was going to improve after the decline in the COVID-19 pandemic. But unfortunately, according to UNICEF, global hunger in 2021 actually increased, leading to aggravating inequalities across and within countries. In addition to COVID-19 pandemic challenges, we also face these current geopolitical challenges. We're living in an unstable world, and that has further increased the food insecurity problem. Moreover, the change in environmental conditions due to climate change has shown that it is vital to address and lead new projects to support agricultural productivity. This is not research that's being done just for the heck of it. This is research that matters to every person on this planet. The United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that 20 to 40% of global crop production is lost annually because of pests. And each year, the impact on the global economy has been absolutely substantial, with plant diseases costing around $220 billion a year, and invasive insects around $70 billion a year. These are extraordinary numbers. And then climate change related issues such as rising temperatures, together with human activities and increased market globalization, have also led to the increase of pests that destroy crucial crops. And these pests are becoming increasingly devastating, and they're causing an alarming hazard to food security and the environment. They add to the problem. And that's why it's absolutely essential that we discuss emerging opportunities and challenges in pest management and technological innovations to support agricultural productivity and food security. These are the problems of our times. These are the problems of our times. These are not just for fun. These are problems of our time. So I know we're eager to get to the thoughts of our lecturer, our awardee, and our panelists on these and other questions. But I want to take just a few more minutes to thank our partners. First, I want to thank Dr. Daniel Robison. Thank you. Our partnership with the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation, of which he is president, has been wonderful. It allows us to have this award ceremony every year, but it also shines a light on the value and the importance of this kind of research. The foundation is committed to promoting a broader and more complete understanding of agriculture and to building upon Charles Valentine Riley's legacy as a whole picture person, a person with a vision for enhancing agriculture through scientific knowledge. This lecture also builds on a long history of association between AAAS and Charles Valentine Riley. It turns out that Mr. Riley was vice president of our biology section in 1888. Our shared mission of promoting science and innovation to benefit all is just as strong today as it was then. And we are proud to have the foundation as a partner. When I look at the history of this place over 175 years, I can tell you that there's some things that people would never recognize. The first president of the AAAS, William Redfield, would never realize that a guy named Sudip Parikh would be the CEO of AAAS. But if he saw this lecture, if he saw what we're trying to accomplish with this lecture, it would fit right into his vision and the founder's vision for what the AAAS is about. So I love this partnership with the foundation. And of course, I also want to give a special thanks to our Section O leadership and also their secretary, Elizabeth Ainsworth. Thank you for your efforts on behalf of the AAAS and for this lecture. And I also want to thank Barbara Stinson, the president of the World Food Prize Foundation, our other partner in the lecture. And the World Food Prize mission is to elevate innovations and inspire action to sustainably increase the quality, quantity, and availability of food for all. And you can certainly see how that fits right into to the mission of today. So now it is my honor to turn to Dr. Robison. Thank you all for being here.
Wow, wasn't that great? What a terrific introduction. Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Dan Robeson. I'm the president of the C.V. Riley Memorial Foundation, and it's a privilege to serve in that role. I also serve as dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Iowa State University. It's a thrill to be here in the AAAS building with so many colleagues, both in person and online, and you're all welcome, and we thank you for tuning in this evening. We've got a great presentation planned. So many of the things that Dr. Parikh just said, I have on my list here to say as well, but I'm going to go ahead and do it because, you hear it once, you hear it twice, you start to remember it. And so it's really important to us to think about these important things and C.V. Riley himself. So it's a pleasure to welcome you here to this 2022 AAAS Charles Valentine Riley Distinguished Lecture. And I welcome you on behalf of the Riley Memorial Foundation and all of its board members and its executive committee, Kathy Witecki, Dan Bush, Neil Dirks, and I'm forgetting one here. I got it on my list. And Alan Grant from Virginia Tech, my colleague Alan Grant. Also the work of the World Food Prize Foundation is part of this as well. Barbara Stinson, her colleague Keegan Kutsky here. And we have support as well from the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, from APLU, Board of Agricultural Assembly, NCFAR, and the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. All of these groups help us in a variety of ways. Charles Valentine Riley was an amazing contributor to science and its use to advance society and our understanding of landscapes in our natural world. He did this work over 100 years ago. He is the namesake of our foundation and of the lecture to be presented today. As a distinguished entomologist himself from more than 100 years ago, he would no doubt want to be alighted tonight and watch the presentation as well. So he is out there with us somewhere. This is about advancing our understanding of the human and natural world. He would be encouraging us forward to do so. Riley believed very much, as Dr. Perry already said, not only in understanding the minutiae of the natural world, but also the whole picture, the big picture, the broad meaning and purposes of our landscapes and how we use them, and the need to think about them in comprehensive manners, and our lecture tonight is exactly on that topic. Here today with AAAS, we honor C.V. Raleigh and further his legacy by welcoming our lecturer, the moderator, and the panel who will inspire us all. It is truly a great honor to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Landis, please come forward. Dr. Douglas A. Landis is a University Distinguished Professor of Entomology at Michigan State University. Dr. Landis is an extraordinary scientist and educator who, in his own words, and I quote, is motivated by a desire to see agriculture coexist with and benefit from biodiversity, and is focused on how landscape structure influences biotic interactions in agroecosystems, close quote. He will speak with us today on this very topic, and indeed, C.V. Raleigh, if he was here, would be leaning forward in his chair to listen. Dr. Landis earned his bachelor's degree at Goshen College and his MS and PhD at North Carolina State University. In 1988, he joined the Department of Entomology at Michigan State University, where he continues his work today. He has published and presented widely with more than 200 peer-reviewed papers and chapters, $40 million in grant funding, more than 50 extension publications, extensive teaching and mentoring, including 23 postdocs, more than 30 graduate students for which he served as major advisor, and more than 100 grad students that he has advised. Dr. Landis is also a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a high honor indeed, a fellow of the Entomological Society of America, and has received many others honors and awards and recognitions. He is has the Distinguished Scientist Award from the International Organization of Biological Control and the Recognition Award for Outstanding Contributions to Agriculture by the Entomological Society of America. History is important, as Dr. Landis told me, and so his recognitions, I'm here to tell you, extend from 1982, when he was awarded the Outstanding Teaching Assistant at NC State, all the way to this evening, where we honor him by offering him this lecture opportunity. Please help me welcome Dr. Landis.
Thank you, Dan, for that kind introduction. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'd like to thank AAAS, the World Food Prize, and the C.V. Raleigh Foundation for making this lecture possible. Let me get to, back up one stage. So as an entomologist, it is a particular honor to think about Dr. Riley's contributions and to honor those as we move forward. He was one of the inventors of classical biological control. He dreamed up the idea that we could import natural enemies of invasive pests, and he did so back in the 1800s. So I feel a lot of kinship with his work more than 100 years later. Again, the title of my talk has been presented. What I want to do today is to focus on the broader theme that the lecture is addressing, and that is opportunities and challenges in agricultural pest management. And we all know that there are severe challenges that are facing agriculture. Sudip has already presented all of these: climate change, biodiversity loss, food insecurity. But I want to introduce you to a fourth challenge, and maybe something that you hadn't considered before, and that is the idea of agricultural land use change. So I'll take a few minutes at the start of my lecture to introduce you to how agricultural landscapes change over time, the implications of that for pest management, and how we might actually think about redesigning those landscapes. Once I've concluded the introductory part, I'm going to sort of do a deep dive for you science nerds out there into some work that we've been doing, thinking about what would happen if we actually incorporated cellulosic bioenergy crops into Midwestern landscapes. How would that affect our overall ecosystem functions? And I'll conclude with some emerging opportunities that technology is making available to us that I think indicate that there's a lot of different ways that we can move forward integrating these concepts into our landscapes. A caveat here, I'm an entomologist first, I'm a landscape ecologist second. And there are many aspects of emerging challenges that I'm not going to touch on today, but we have an excellent group of panelists who are, if you look at the bottom of this, we have Linda Kinkel, who does a lot of work in the soil with microbial organisms and microbiomes. There's great diversity and genetic diversity in agricultural systems that Megan Fritz is going to be amplifying. And then these are systems that are human managed, and they have to deal with people and institutions, and I think Dr. Bradbury will hit on some of those topics. So agricultural intensification. Agricultural intensification is the process that we've been engaged in for the last 50 to 70 years, and it is how we have increased crop yields dramatically across many parts of the world. Agricultural intensification is defined as the increased reliance on high-yielding cultivars, typically grown in monoculture and supported by inorganic fertilizers and pesticides. And we use mechanization to capture economies of scale in order to make these systems even more productive and more efficient. And while agricultural intensification has undoubtedly raised crop yields and made more food available to more people, lifting people out of poverty, it's beginning to show its limitations, I believe. And that if we think about moving forward sustainably in the future, we may need to move beyond solely thinking about further intensification of our systems. And one of the reasons for that is that agricultural intensification has been linked to the global biodiversity crisis in that it's clearly been shown that intensification is associated with declines of biodiversity of many different types. Mammals, birds, more recently plants and insects have been shown to have reduced species abundance in agricultural landscapes that have been intensified. So we might say, well, loss of species is tragic, but we need to have agricultural production. Maybe these are portions of the globe that we can set aside for that purpose, as long as we have sufficient biodiversity to actually support the functions that we require for agriculture. Unfortunately, the declines in diversity are starting to show up in declines of functional diversity in birds and insects. We don't have birds doing seed dispersal in certain parts of the globe anymore. We don't have insects that are available to provide pollination and pest control services in certain systems as well. And when that happens, we lose things that we really do care about, the ecosystem services of pollination, pest suppression, and ultimately the yield that comes from these landscapes. So I want to clarify some further aspects of agricultural intensification. This is lesser known, and that's what I call landscape simplification. So both of these pictures were taken a few years ago in southern Michigan, where I live. The one on the left shows a mix of forests and grasslands and annual crops. And it is a landscape that, if you look carefully, you could detect that this has been shaped by animal agriculture. There are small fields that have fences around them and hedgerows for confining animals, and animals are a component of keeping this landscape in the condition that it currently is in. Really just a few miles away, literally a few miles away, on slightly more productive soils, that landscape has changed completely over the past 50 years. And it is now comprised pretty much solely of 3 annual crops. Corn, soybean, and wheat are currently grown in this area, along with some remnants of the forest and a few of the hedgerows and fence rows that used to be there. And this represents a change in both the composition of the landscape, the number and types of habitats that are present, but also the configuration of the landscape, the shapes and the sizes and the interrelationships of fields. And this is very important in influencing how pests and their natural enemies, the predators and parasites that attack them, move around the landscape. So there's been a theory that landscape simplification might result in reduced pest suppression. So if we think of that focal field there in the center, the one in black, farmers are making the decisions at that individual field level. They're scouting it to determine whether they have pests that need to be treated or not. They recognize that the pests and the natural enemies are possibly moving in from the edges of those fields or other areas of the farm shown in white, or perhaps even further from more distant parts of the landscape shown in blue. And it's the relative timing and abundance of pests and natural enemies that create the balance or imbalance as to whether pest suppression actually occurs. And in the year 2000, the soybean aphid was discovered in the Midwestern United States. And it became a sort of an existential crisis for soybean growers, because soybeans yields could be declined by 30 to 40%. So we really needed to understand what about our systems could help us manage the soybean aphid. And we had fortunate ability to do a 4-state study where we asked, how does landscape simplification affect the biological control of the soybean aphid? And in short, what we found is that the aphid is adequately controlled by certain co-evolved natural enemies when the landscape at the 1 kilometer or at the 1.5 kilometer scale, which is about a mile, so the composition of the landscape about a mile surrounding the focal field, if it's diverse enough, it supplies predators at the right time and at the right rates, and the soybean aphid never causes an outbreak. It's only when the landscape has been simplified to the point where these natural enemies are not present at the right time that we get these soybean aphid outbreaks, and that persists today. So is this a one-off, just a unique occurrence that happened in the Midwest? And I'd like to point out that here's a meta-analysis, a global meta-analysis of 10 different studies comprising 15 different data sets where Roosh et al. In 2016, along the y-axis is the mean level of natural pest control, and the x-axis is the proportion of cultivated land within 1 kilometer of the focal field. And you can see that negative relationship over the entire study. And then on the right, you can see the results of the meta-analysis. Each of the individual studies show a negative relationship between the proportion of cultivated land and the amount of aphid control. And the black dot on the right is the overall summary. So, yes, we can see that landscape simplification might have an effect on pests. What do farmers actually experience? We were able in the early, about 2008, to begin to study this as part of the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, where I'll tell you a little bit more about in the future. But my colleagues, Tim Meehan and Claudio Gortan, really led the study where we took USDA data at the county level, on the left, and that is the proportion of an individual county that is in cultivated crops. And this can approach 80 to 90% in some of the darkest colors that you see here on the left. And then we looked at relative insecticide use in those same counties, again from USDA data. And I tell my graduate students, you don't always need statistics. You can actually just squint at this graph and see that there's a positive correlation. But of course, we do the statistics, and after factoring out all of the factors that we think could influence this, that we have ability to look into, farm size, the number of crops they grow, the types of crops they grow, their access to equipment, the age of the operator, we still see this persistent residual effect of the percentage of the county in cropland is resulting in increased insecticide use. So this is troubling, but we can flip that on its head and say, okay, what could we do about that situation? We know how landscapes are affecting pests and their natural enemies. Can we actually design landscapes that are pest suppressive? And I want to give credit here to my European colleagues who have been thinking and working in this line of work for a bit longer than we have. And really what they're showing is that the biophysical and the socioeconomic constraints on a particular landscape interacting with things at the field, the farm, and the landscape level set the stage for whether redesign is necessary and whether it can be accomplished. And in the cases that they found it has been accomplished, it's when researchers were already studying the factors and had a deep knowledge of what was influencing different problems within the landscape, and stakeholders came to them and said, we have a problem, can you help us figure this out? And through that engagement, they developed what they called actionable knowledge. What is the knowledge that research and stakeholders can co-produce together that actually allows them to make different decisions to manage their landscape in different ways? And so for purposes of my talk, I just want you to remember 3 things. It has to be evidence-based. We need science in order to drive this forward. We need to embrace the context dependency. So every situation is going to be different, and that's actually to our advantage. We can use that to provide information about landscape redesign that is really applicable to a particular area. And stakeholder engagement is vital. If we don't have the stakeholders, we will not be conducting landscape change. Okay, so some of you might be saying, wow, that sounds like a big job. Is there any examples where this has actually taken place? And I want to point to work of, again, Dutch colleagues. The Dutch have been reinventing and redesigning their landscape for centuries. And in fact, this area called the Hoogse Waard in the southern Netherlands is an area that was reclaimed from the sea by building dikes and pumping the water out and creating agricultural land more than 500 years ago. But in current times, the residents of this polder realized that their principal economic drivers were agriculture and tourism, but that both of those were being threatened by declining water quality and in particular declines in bird habitat. They're a special stopover point for wetland birds, and people come to that area specifically to be able to see rare wetland birds, and the declines in water quality were limiting their ability to see that as a future for themselves. And then there was this other thing. They were very close to Rotterdam, and they were concerned that they were just going to become a bedroom community and that agriculture would really not be the basis. And the community took action. They went to Altera, which is a research organization in Wageningen, and they said, we want some help thinking about our landscape and how we might change that. They engaged a multi-stakeholder group comprised of the Water Control Board, the farmers, nature organizations, and many others. And they undertook about a 2-year process of dialogue and discussion about how they could change their landscape in ways that would fundamentally solve the issues that they were having. And they decided that they needed to manage their dikes differently, keep them greener and more biodiverse. Farmers agreed to not spray pesticides and not plant crops within 1 meter of an agricultural ditch. That's not giving up a lot of land, but it's an important meter. And in other places, they actually planted intentionally flowering plants to provide resources for natural enemies and pollinators. Thank you. And these practices have persisted for more than 20 years. So they have been adopted by the community, and they are in place and working. So a little closer to home, I want to point out a different situation in Iowa. You all know Iowa is an intensely agricultural state, #1 producer of corn and soybeans. Many parts of the state have this rolling topography, which is known to be prone to soil erosion. And as a result, farmers have for many years, decades, planted these grass waterways through their fields in order to help move water off the landscape in ways that don't cause erosion. But it was still allowing nutrients to run off and impairing water quality. And there's this sort of intellectual knowledge that, yes, we're probably contributing to the nutrient load in the Gulf of Mexico, and yes, maybe Gulf hypoxia is something that should be of concern to us here in Iowa, but oftentimes it takes something closer to home to maybe wake some folks up. And this is not the sole example, but I just like this headline: "Canceled swim portion of an Iowa triathlon highlights water control issues." So when you can't hold the swim portion of your local triathlon, it may hit a different segment of society to say, oh, maybe we have a problem that we should address. Fortunately, folks at Iowa State have been thinking about this for a long time, and a multidisciplinary group has been created, what they call the Prairie Strips Project, science-based trials of row crops integrated with prairie strips. Multidisciplinary team, soil scientists, agronomists, conservation biologists, entomologists, and many more, came up with the idea that we know we have this issue with water quality. Let's, instead of moving water off the landscape rapidly, let's slow the pace of water movement off the landscape. Let's take prairie strips, the original vegetation of this area, and plant it perpendicular to the flow of water. It's a little hard to see in this photo, but you can see the perpendicular or the parallel strips of lighter green. Those are the early stages of prairie strips. And this slows the movement of water downslope. It causes increased infiltration, reduces nutrient and pesticide runoff, as well as soil erosion, and has other effects in terms of biodiversity. I think the team has been very effective in creating very simple messages. Prairie strips, what can prairie strips do? In fact, what can taking just 10% of your cropland and do? Well, 40% less runoff, 95% less soil export, 90% less phosphorus. Those are numbers that everybody can get behind and understand. And at the same time, they have a 4-fold increase in plant species richness and a doubling of bird species and I think a quadrupling of abundance. So, additionally, stakeholders have always been part of this process, and now stakeholders are actually taking a lead role in beginning to roll this out, or are rolling this out to other farms. So that was built into their design of this project, and it's been highly effective. And a further aspect is that there are now policies that are supporting this. So prairie strips have become, as far as the 2018 Farm Bill, have become a recognized conservation practice, CP 43, that farmers can get subsidies for planting these strips on their land. And I know my numbers are out of date. Lisa Schulte, who knows these numbers by heart, is in the audience tonight. But I think it's up to 15 states, thousands of acres of prairie strips and tens of thousands of acres of cropland have been protected by these activities in the region. So it's really starting to make an impact, not only in Iowa, but across the Midwest as well. Okay, so I want to change gears and think a little bit about the future. So one of the futures that we envision for the Midwest is the production of cellulosic bioenergy crops. We're currently an area of intensive corn and soybean production. About 40% of that corn grain is going to produce ethanol that we put into gasoline for transportation fuel. But there are sustainability issues with this, and for a long time, the DOE has been thinking about how do we create different systems, and how can we create a truly sustainable, renewable bioenergy system? And renewable bioenergy is an important part of all the IPCC scenarios for addressing climate change, typically in conjunction with carbon sequestration, carbon capture and sequestration. So it's an important task to know about. And we were given the opportunity to work with University of Wisconsin and Michigan State University, lead a bioenergy research center funded by the DOE, which has been given the remit to really look at this from a very basic point of view and look into the future. How can we do this and how can we do it better? So as an insect ecologist getting involved with this 10 or 15 years ago, some of my questions were quite simple. I know from any very basic agroecology book that I've ever read that, an annual crop, corn is our current bioenergy crop is an annual, it's a monoculture. We grow highly productive cultivars and support them with relatively high inputs. That's a recipe for lower biodiversity in general. On the other hand, restoring perennial prairie vegetation as a potential bioenergy crop has a different effect. It's perennial, it's polycultural, has many different plants growing in it. It's generally almost fully native and requires little or no inputs to produce its highest potential output. And nicely in the middle is a crop that the DOE has been working with for 30 or 40 years probably, which is switchgrass. Switchgrass is a native plant. It is a perennial. It is seeded as a monoculture, but becomes polycultural over time as weeds invade. And it nicely fits in the middle in terms of input requirements. It requires about 1/3 the amount of nitrogen in order to reach its maximum productivity, as does corn. So we envisioned that this would have maybe an intermediate effect on biodiversity. We envisioned biodiversity being lowest in corn, intermediate in switchgrass, and potentially higher in something like restored prairie. Our hypotheses were also pretty simple. We thought that bioenergy crop type would impact the biodiversity of multiple taxa, and we had the time and funding to look at a variety of organisms over 10 or 15 years. And we thought that biodiversity profiles would be positively related to ecosystem services that those organisms produce. And colleagues, Claudia Grattan and I, and many postdocs and students over the years were able to look at these in a lot of sites in southern Wisconsin and southern Michigan in existing corn, soybean, or corn, switchgrass, and prairie sites. So what did we find? I'll orient you to the graphs here. On the y-axis is the richness of the taxa indicated, so basically the number of species that we would find on average for maize, switchgrass, and prairie. And you can see if you look at panel A for plants, indeed corn has the lowest species richness. Corn and a few weeds are what we find in cornfields, a bit more in switchgrass and even higher in prairie. So this was sort of the stair-step pattern that we envisioned might take place. But then we look at panel B, which is methanotropic bacteria. These are bacteria that live in the soil and consume methane as their primary carbon source, and they sequester it in the soil in microbial biomass. And here we see that the operational taxonomic units, OTUs, essentially species of these bacteria, is modestly higher in switchgrass and prairie, but not different from one another. Panel C is herbivorous arthropods, things that eat plants. are actually, we find more families of those in the two perennial crops, prairie and switchgrass, which is a little concerning. But panel D shows that we also find more families of their predators in those two perennial crops as well. We see more bees and more grassland bird or more breeding birds in the two perennial crops. So this is all sort of lining up. Wow, these perennial crops look like they're supporting biodiversity and perhaps services. What are the services that those organisms provide? Well, I mentioned before that methanotrophic bacteria consume methane. And so we have plotted methane consumption on the y-axis, and corn is a net emitter of methane on an annual basis. So there's not enough methanotropes in corn in order to deal with all the nitrogen that is put in, whereas the two perennials sequester considerably large amounts of methane and not allowing it to be released into the atmosphere. And it's a very potent greenhouse gas, so this is a big effect. Our predators do their job, and when we put the sentinel eggs out into these fields, we find much higher predation in the two perennial crops. We get greater pollination of sentinel plants in prairies versus corn. We see more grassland birds, which are in decline, and we see lower arrival of pest aphids in the two perennial crops than we see in corn. Aphids seek out and find the cornfields. So I'm an ecologist, and in ecology, there's always trade-offs, as in most aspects of life, and the biggest trade-off is in yield. Corn, we have bred and we manage corn to be enormously productive in the Midwest. And the switchgrass and prairie were largely on the landscape for conservation purposes, not particularly biomass production purposes, and they definitely, and they were unfertilized, so they definitely produced lower yields. I think this is actually to be a trend that would be hard to overcome. I think corn is really an ideal crop if all you want to do is produce biomass. So we've taken that, and then we asked the big question, okay, so what if we started to make changes? What if we took just the lowest producing corn and soybean ground in the Midwest, and we converted those annual croplands into perennial crops like switchgrass? And what would be the impacts? Because those low productivity lands have a particular distribution in the landscape that's fixed, if we chose to put a perennial crop on there, what would happen to the overall landscape, and how would we then evaluate its effects on things like birds and other organisms? And the details here aren't really important. Just know that for bird diversity, it's almost uniformly positive to switch to a perennial crop in some parts of the landscape. Very similar story for pollinator communities, and a very similar story for predators and pest suppression. But what the point that I do want you to take on is that there's variability. So given that these marginal lands or low productivity lands have a given distribution, if there's already a lot of grassland in the area where one of those exists, and you put a little more grassland in that area, it doesn't really move the needle very much. But in our more productive agricultural lands, where I'll show later there are still lower producing sites, it would make a big difference to put some of these perennial crops there. And we really sort of concluded 10 years of research by saying, it comes down to these things. Crop traits, particularly perenniality, seem to really drive the effects we see. Within field plant diversity is very important. Having flowering plants in agriculture to support pollinators, natural enemies, and other organisms is really important. And that, as I just explained, this local scaled landscape context or composition really matters. Okay, so cellulosic crops have not become a commercial reality yet for a variety of reasons, but we still share our information with farmers, and it's interesting to think, well, how are farmers responding? So here's a landscape that's typical of southern Michigan. I chose it because one of the farmers I want to describe here farms in a similar type of landscape. This isn't exactly where they farm, but quite similar, dominated by corn, soybeans, and wheat. And this farmer is what I would characterize as an innovator. He's not an early adopter. He's actually innovating these systems on his own. And what he has come to the conclusion, he's very much driven by price or profitability. He's profit sensitive, and he knows exactly which fields and which parts of his fields are not making a return on the investment. And he, independent of us, made the choice to take some of those lands and put them into what he calls native spaces. These are perennial habitats with perennial or warm season grasses and flowering plants. He's taken fields out of production, and he's taken lower productivity parts of fields out of production. So on his 5,000 acres, he's already converted about 6% of his land into these native spaces. And he's doing it purely because it cash flows from his perspective. So just to conclude here and draw maybe some simple conclusions, if we were to characterize this 15 years of research, if you're thinking about adding cellulosic bioenergy crops, they need to be strategically positioned, they need to be productive, they probably should be perennial, and polycultures bring many benefits that monocultures do not. Okay, so I want to conclude here in the last 10 minutes just thinking about some emerging opportunities. And I'll talk about some things that are already in existence, like precision conservation, a bit more advanced remote sensing, and thinking about autonomous farming in the future. So precision conservation is based on this concept. I mean, farmers know what parts of their fields are highly productive and what parts are low productivity. But the advent of technology that provides real-time in the combine information on productivity and yield maps has really brought home opportunities for conservation. Farmers know that on and have the equipment in some cases to plant fewer seeds in lower productivity areas, or use less fertilizers so that they're not lost in the system. And colleagues at Michigan State have asked, okay, well, how much of this land is available? And using a combination of remote sensing and crop modeling, they produced what you see on the left. This is what they call stability maps. And this is a single field in Illinois. And in green, you see areas which are consistently high yielding. In blue, areas that are consistent, or in red, areas that are consistently low yielding. And in blue, areas that move back and forth from being high yielding, low yielding, depending on whether it is a wet year or a dry year, is the biggest driver. And in this field, it's 19%, but when you add it up across the region, about 26% of one of the most highly productive agricultural landscapes in the world has subfield areas which are not producing a return on investment or a stably low yield. And another study in Iowa, from a somewhat different perspective, reached a similar conclusion. In some years, they had as low as 2% of the subfield areas that were not productive, but in other years, as much as 27% that were not making a return on investment. So what could we do with those areas? Well, colleagues in North Dakota have said, well, we have this area in red, which is low productivity for corn. Let's put a fence around it and graze it and grow corn on the remainder. And what you can see here is that their overall yield of the corn goes up by about 20 bushels. Their profit increases from a negative to a $13 per acre profit. And their return on investment, even though they had to put extra money into fencing and managing the grazing, they get a positive return on investment compared to a negative return if the entire field is considered. But I want to emphasize, that's just North Dakota. That's not going to fly everywhere. Context dependency is everything. So what else could you do with these low productivity lands? Wildlife habitat is one option, perhaps bioenergy crops, perhaps wind and solar. We are in a pollinator crisis, and perhaps in a lot of areas, pollinator habitat would make a lot of sense. And creative combinations of many of these could also be placed at strategic points in the landscape. I want to just talk a little bit about remote sensing and unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs. We're already using these for crop health monitoring, pest detection, and spot treatment. And my group is interested in thinking about whether we can use these for biodiversity monitoring and prediction. And we fortunately have this long-term experiment at the Kellogg Biological Station where we have 10 different potential bioenergy crops ranging from annuals to highly complex perennials in replicated plots. And we have taken biodiversity metrics of a variety of taxa in quite intensive detail, and also fly over them with drones and airplanes to detect what electromagnetic radiation spectra that we can detect from those at various times of the year, derive various indices, and it creates a huge data set that is impossible for humans to sort through, but through machine learning and random forest modeling, we can ask the question, what of this mass of information that we can detect from space, basically, or from the air, could be possibly related to biodiversity? And we've actually found some quite predictive indices, or some quite predictive metrics. These are 4 different types of taxa: plants, butterflies, bees, and birds. On the y-axis is the predicted effective number of species. It's basically species richness corrected for rare species. And the one-to-one line is in black. If we were perfect in making the prediction, we would be on that black line. We're a little bit above it at low species numbers, and we're a little bit below it at higher species richness, but only by 1 or 2 species. So if you ask my graduate students and undergraduates who have to spend hours toiling in the field whether they'd like to be out there counting insects, or could they get the same, almost the same answer by flying a drone over the field, I think I know what answer they'd give you. So we're looking forward to how this might play out. Finally, I just want to conclude. Autonomous farming is coming. Every major equipment manufacturer is producing autonomous power plants to pull different types of equipment. They're often battery powered. They're lighter than the current equipment and often equipped with tracks because farmers are very concerned about compaction. And we know that compaction is a major limitation on crop yield. But currently, these newest ones are being sized to pull similarly sized equipment or modestly smaller equipment because that's the type of fields that we currently have. But manufacturers are also very interested in much smaller robots, and they think that there's great efficiencies to be gained in using what's called robot swarms. Smaller robots that can do different things and do it collectively or independently and produce a smaller footprint, particularly in terms of compaction. And in an interesting economic analysis, colleagues over in England found that robot swarms actually made farming in these complex landscapes as cost-effective as in farming in more highly simplified landscapes. So when you can use the robots to take away the human labor and the time constraints, we get great efficiencies. So to conclude, hopefully I provided some evidence that agricultural intensification and landscape simplification are related to reduced pest suppression in many cases, not all, but in many. But hopefully you also have gained an appreciation for the fact that we can actually take what we know and redesign landscapes to improve on pest suppression. Now, a postdoc reminded me, you know, Doug, no farmer is ever going to redesign a landscape just for pest suppression. And I have to admit that they're right. But we've shown in multiple studies, we the larger scientific community, that these redesign processes can have multiple benefits. And if pest suppression can be one of those, let's make sure that it's on the table. And we also know that success is context dependent and there are going to be trade-offs. Finally, I think emerging technologies can provide new opportunities for landscape design, but they require investment. And they require investment in research, and I particularly want to put in a plug for long-term research. We've greatly benefited by DOE funding over 15 years and NSF funding for more than 30 years at some of our sites, which has allowed us to collect data sets that are unique in the world and allow us to have predictive capacity that we wouldn't have otherwise. We also need supportive policies. We need more things like CP43 that encourage and incentivize farmers to create spaces for biodiversity and keep that in the agricultural landscape. And of course, we need human capital, and we need people who can work across disciplines. All of the successful cases of landscape redesign are based on multidisciplinary work, so I want to put in a pitch for that and for funding that type of work in the future. There truly are too many people to thank, so I'm thanking just the GLBRC biodiversity team, which has contributed to that sort of core data set. Past members and current members are shown there, and the funding agencies that have supported us over the years. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi. So I'm Michael Fernandez. I am the director of the AAAS Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues. We have the privilege of helping coordinate this lecture every year. Our mission is to bring clear, concise, and actionable scientific evidence to decision makers, from policymakers to parents. So we're thrilled to be part of this lecture. What we have next is I'm just song and dance while they come sit down, is a panel discussion. This panel is not as respondents to the lecture, but really to continue the conversation that Dr. Landis started. So what's going to happen is we're going to have about 15 minutes or so of moderated discussion, and then this is where you all come in. We're going to open up the floor for Q&A. So for people in the room, there's 2 microphones on either side. So when you'll be thinking of your questions, and then when that time comes, you can line up with those microphones. I will also be looking at monitoring the Q&A section in the Zoom for people online. You can submit a question by using the Q&A button, and I'll be forwarding those on to Fred. So I'm just very briefly, we have as our moderator Fred Gould, who's Executive Director of the North Carolina State University Genetics and Genomics Academy and co-director of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center. We have Dr. Stephen Bradbury, who is Professor of Environmental Toxicology in the Departments of Natural Resource Ecology and Management and Plant Pathology, Entomology, and Microbiology at Iowa State University. Dr. Megan Fritz, who's an assistant professor of integrative anthropod biology at the Department of Entomology at the University of Maryland, and Dr. Linda Kinkel, who is professor of plant pathology at the University of Minnesota. So thank you all, and Fred, take it away.
All right. Well, this is great. So Doug, that was a wonderful lecture. Thank you so much. And Doug has given us so much to respond to or take in another direction, and we have 15 minutes. So I want to, as moderator, take just 1 second to talk about 2 pieces that Doug brought up. One is one of those slides that talked about actionable knowledge, and the other context dependence. Wonderful and important things. And he also said that he had support for 30 years from Energy Department and NSF. And that's what I want to comment that it's so good when there are such research initiatives that give you long-term support so you can come up with actionable knowledge, which Doug has done fabulously. So again, thank you for that. So I'm going to just start off this conversation with a written question here to all of you, and to go around and take a few minutes of your own. Given your specific expertise and perspective, are there other components of agricultural landscape change or design that need to be considered, and put it in the context of what would be the actionable knowledge that you need? So I'm going to start right here with Megan.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, so I'm Megan Fritz, as I was introduced as, and my interests really are in understanding the importance of maintaining variation within a species, within a population, and in particular genomic variation. And so these are differences in DNA sequences between individuals. And those differences in DNA sequences are heritable, they're passed down through generations, and they can encode differences in phenotypes. And my particular interest is in insecticide resistance. So I really appreciate some of the discussion that Doug had about the ideas of planting native habitats, the ability of those native habitats to maybe promote spaces for populations to grow of beneficials that have pest suppressive roles in the landscape. And I can see a room for sort of the integration or enhancement of genomic variation as well, which leads to adaptive potential. And that adaptive potential for sort of a changing climate. But really, I want to talk about specifically refuge in the landscape for the maintenance of genomic variation in pest species. And I think this seems a little bit weird, but I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we know that pest management is going to have an important role to play in feeding our growing planet. It's going to be true that growers are going to have to apply insecticidal technologies, pesticidal technologies, either as sprayable technologies or plant incorporated protectants in the landscape. And what we do know is also true is that sort of the rate of discovery of novel pest management technologies is being outpaced by the rate of the evolution of resistance by pests to these technologies. Okay, so when I talk about refugia in the landscape, what I'm really talking about is resistance management and the role that those refugia have to play in resistance management, maintaining diversity in pest insects at specific genes that encode insecticide resistance phenotypes. So the idea is that you plant these refugia in the landscape. They could be wild hosts of pests that are of agricultural importance, or they could be actually cultivated crops that are unprotected and meant to be damaged by these pests. And the idea is that then they serve as sort of refuge for susceptible DNA sequences in those pest species in the landscape. So as we apply pest management practices, what we're doing really is reducing genomic variation at specific genes that are responsible for pesticide resistance. We're selecting against individuals that have susceptibility, and over periods of time, what we see is that these pests, more and more of them have DNA sequences that encode resistance phenotypes to the point where growers have difficulty managing pest populations, and that can impact their yields. So the idea is that you plant refugia in the landscape for susceptible pests, that those susceptible pests can emerge. And if you have a resistant individual that arrives from a protected field, one that's protected by management practice, the likelihood is that it will be high that they'll mate with a susceptible individual. And those offspring have one copy of their gene from their resistant parent, one copy of their gene from a susceptible parent. They mate, produce a heterozygous offspring. And those heterozygotes are then susceptible to what we call a high dose of pest management practice in a protected field. So this strategy for resistance management, a high dose refuge strategy, has been really important for suppressing insecticide resistance in the landscape, in particular for Bt crops. So crops that are transgenic, that produce an insecticidal protein from the bacterium Bacillus thuringiensis. The US EPA, Environmental Protective Agency, was really instrumental in sort of organizing, with contribution from stakeholders, growers, government, academic researchers, and so on, a resistance management approach, high-dose refuge strategy to suppress resistance in the landscape. And so I guess sort of in conclusion, going back to the original question, I really think that we have experimental evidence that this high-dose refuge strategy has been, it's functional in the landscape. For pests that met the high-dose refuge criteria in the landscape, many of them have not. They remain susceptible to Bt crops. They've not evolved resistance. And so maybe one of these ways that we can redesign or think about the design of agricultural landscapes is taking some of those low productivity spaces and planting them to unprotected crops in a way that they can maintain susceptible populations in the landscape and reduce resistance evolution.
Great, thank you. All right, Steve.
Well, it's pretty hard to add to Doug's discussion. But one thing I think about when we're talking about designing landscapes or visioning a new landscape is that there are a lot of actors in the landscape. Lots of folks that may have... Your microphone's not on.
Is that better? There we go. In these landscapes will be people that have different values, and they'll view the outcomes of the landscape differentially. It isn't bad, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's something that we need to think about. Some people may have more of a burden, some groups may have more of a benefit by the redesigned landscape. So we've got some complex interactions between social systems, natural systems, and new technology. So I think one of the things to be thinking about as we look forward is how do we get engaged research? And Doug mentioned this, where scientists and non-scientists are working together as equals to help refine the questions that need to be answered, perhaps getting to discovery quicker by having that kind of meaningful collaboration and hopefully moving into implementation using that science. So I think one of the challenges going forward is sorting out what kinds of goods and services can come out of that landscape, food to feed the world, but also biodiversity or the bioeconomy. There are a variety of things that can come out there, but they're not, I don't think there's a silver bullet that we're going to get everything we want in one design. So Doug, like you mentioned, how do we deal with trade-offs? And that's going to have to be a societal decision. And how can our entomology, weed management, genomics research help facilitate society making those options or fulfilling those options? I guess the last thing I would think about
is the scale issue. So prairie strips and some of the shots that Doug gave, or some of the work we're doing with wildlife or species of concern conservation, we're dealing at a relatively small scale. And maybe we're in an area where the farmers know each other, their ag retailers know each other, their crop advisors know each other, the pheasant forever biologists are in the landscape, and they can sort of work some of this through, but eventually they hit a wall. And because there's drivers that are bigger than their landscape that are driving some of the decisions unconsciously perhaps that farmers are making, crop advisors are making. So how do we create systems that allow us to do this bottom up, but it's complemented by a top-down set of policies and support systems to help make this happen?
Thanks a lot. That really brings up the wicked problems, right, of actually instituting these things. Thank you. So,
And maybe these could be wicked opportunities.
oh, okay, good. I love that. Wicked opportunities.
I like wicked opportunities. I'm Linda Kinkel, and I'm a microbial ecologist. So speaking of the landscape scale, microbes exist at such a smaller spatial scale. The communities, the populations, and the diversity, they're all organized at sub-millimeter scales in soil. So when we think about landscape scale management and translating that to microbiomes, there still is a big chasm in our capacity to do that well, to really understand how we can manage at a landscape scale to achieve microbiome benefits, microbial benefits to crop productivity. But the reality is that microbiomes in soil are tremendously important to crop productivity. We've thought hundreds and hundreds of years about how to manage plants, how to feed plants, how to tend plants, how to protect plants. And we've ignored what microbes do already to feed plants, protect plants, help them be productive. Over the past 10 years, we've begun to really get some tremendous insights into how we can manage soil microbiomes to support this productivity. But interfacing with these landscape scale and larger processes remains almost non-existent. We're not talking. I loved hearing the ideas of refugia and the challenge of, if you are simplifying the landscape, does that have negative consequences for diversity? And it's interesting, your one exception was your methanogens, your methanotropes, that you saw a little bit of a drop with the simplification, but not statistically significant. Microbiomes in soil are believed to be hyper diverse with a tremendous amount of functional redundancy. What if you cut the diversity 50%? Does it have any impact on the functional potential of that soil microbiome? And so understanding the consequences of habitat simplification or prairie strips and so on to this microbiome function is a space that we desperately need to tackle, because ultimately if we put all of these things together, the whole will be much greater than the sum of the parts. This was a wonderful, I loved your talk, Doug, and my mind was whirling with the translation of factors, this idea of simplification. In fact, some crop monocultures do a great job at making soil microbiomes actually more pest suppressive than polycultures, which seems profoundly counterintuitive. But usually when we see something that's unexpected, that's where the interesting science lies. So,
Doug, do you want to respond a little bit to all of that?
I just have to say, it's always the pathologist who. So, touche. I mean, yeah, that's one area where simplification can actually bring benefits.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little chance to talk about something. And I want to say that we've been talking a lot about monocultures. And from a genetics and genomics perspective, we're not just talking about a monoculture, we're talking about a monogenotype, right? So a field is a cornfield or a soybean field is basically a genotype. One, you know, as Megan was pointing out, you know, and maybe for BT, you know, we have some fields that have BT crops and one that is missing that gene. But for a long time, plant pathologists have recognized that if you have a multi-lines, right, where you have in that field a monoculture, in a sense it's just one crop, but plants differ from each other, some susceptible to a pathogen, some resistant. We all know about COVID, right? Some of the people are wearing masks, some of those plants are wearing masks, and it doesn't spread it. That really benefits. And we've had the actionable knowledge. What we lack is the savvy of interacting with society and figuring out how to get that kind of thing go forward. And Doug was bringing out the new technologies. In the past, there were issues about having these multi-lines because one would ripen a little earlier than another or something like that. But now, with the ability to make much more specific changes, we should be able to have multi-lines that maybe give the benefit as a monoculture to the great, good microbes, but also inhibit the fungal thing. So I just want to add that up. How are we doing on time? Do we... 5? Okay, so you
Can
want
I
to, yes,
follow up on that
definitely.
just super briefly? So I had the pleasure of writing a nomination for a fellowship with an amazing scientist in Europe, and I learned a little bit about ecological breeding, which I didn't know a lot about. And it basically takes this concept of mixtures and multi-lines, which were devised deliberately, would take 5 different lines of wheat that are very similar, but just each have a different resistance gene to a particular pathogen. And you mix those up and you spread them out in Iowa, and you have better protection and stability of disease suppression. But this idea of ecological breeding mixes populations in a field, and you deliberately have traits that are important like maturity and quality. They're homogeneous, but insect resistance, pathogen resistance is mixed up. And you don't just have 4 or 5 things, you have hundreds of things, and you maintain this diverse population that's one crop, but has diversity for these functions that are abiotic and biotic stress related. And the argument is that these will be much more stable in suppression against pests and pathogens, but also more stable. Our weather is becoming more unpredictable. Is it going to be a hot year? Is it going to be deluge? Is it going to be dry? If you've got that diversity embedded within a crop, can you, again, provide that robustness against the environment and biotic and abiotic environment? I thought it was a really clever principle.
Yeah, and just come back to Megan's comment, the EPA has helped us in some sense to have a little inkling into the fact that you could do that. I think they call that seed with the bags that come with 2 different kinds of seed.
Yeah,
and that refuge in a bag, they call it, right? So yeah, you could ratchet that up. Again, I want to give Doug a chance to comment on this conversation. Do you want to add anything more?
I think just to say, it's very complex. And I think it can get overwhelming at times. Mm-hmm. But where I find that the traction can be gained is when you start trying to understand the realities of a particular farming community or region, and dive deep into those situations or the realities, and then find what are the leverage points where you could actually use this to get multiple benefits. And I think I maybe didn't say this enough, but my postdoc is right. Farmers are not, and society is not going to change the landscape just for pest suppression. You're going to have to find, I believe, those areas of intersection where there are multiple benefits to society that can be gained, and that will allow you to gain the traction to actually make change. So I'll just conclude with that.
Right. Okay, other general comments? Steve, do you want to comment on the societal pieces? I mean, I think Doug was just alluding to some of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wicked problem.
More wicked opportunity.
But I mean, some of the observations, working with communities on conservation practices in their landscape or pest resistance management, the need to have the challenges is when communication is dissonant. And when producers are hearing different things from different trusted advisors, it isn't that trusted advisors are evil or anything, it's just where they're at. And so being able to get that dialogue going, maybe being part of an engaged research project so that you're soliciting their input, and part of it is to get the natural science research going, but also to aid the different sectors in a community to better understand what the issues are. And this is where you also see the scale problem playing out. So sometimes when you're in a community and you're working through resistance management options, the reps for the big companies, the big seed companies, they know exactly what should be going on for resistance management, but they're constrained. I mean, they're paid by sales. They're not paid by giving advice that maybe you should use a product from one of my competitors to break the cycle, right? So how do we not throw that rep under the bus, right? But how do we have this engagement, with big ag? How do you have that dialogue with EPA, with USDA, to try to create space for people to explore these ideas, to not be hung up on what they can or can't do, but get outside the box and take advantage of all the really cool natural science research that's going on.
Great. Any other final words before we open this up to the audience? All right. So we want to open up the questions to the audience. We have microphones.
Yep, so there are microphones on either side of the room. If you have a question, just go ahead. I have a couple from online, so we can start with that while you're thinking or gathering. First one, these are actually both, Doug, I think for you. So you tied landscape simplification to simplification of the farmers or farming. Complex landscape was managed for both animals and plants, and the more simplified landscape was just plants, for example. Can you comment on the impacts of sort of agricultural business on this simplification over time? So a couple embedded questions in there. Where's all that plant biomass going? Is that going to export? And has increasing farm size been a primary driver in ag landscape simplification?
So that's a big multifactorial question. Let me try to address the parts that I feel comfortable with. I think the landscape change, the move from having animals commonly integrated in agricultural operations to the segregation where there are farms that mostly do animals and farms that mostly do field crops, that has been, I believe, a big driver of the simplification that we've seen in Michigan and perhaps in other Midwestern states as well. But that was done for probably very logical economic reasons, and that one may be a difficult one to push back on. The role of industry, I think Steve's already discussed some of this. Their role in many ways is to produce profit for the shareholders. The more that we could develop systems where that can happen while we're also maintaining the diversity of approaches, diversity of genotypes, diversity of landscape elements. I believe there is profit in agricultural landscapes that are more diverse than they are today, and so we just need to be clever in figuring out how we can bring that to fruition.
Oh, go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you so much for a really great lecture and a wonderful panel discussion. It's particularly great to hear individual heterogeneity come up in the ag space. As I studied it from a mammalogy and climate change standpoint, so nice to see it cross-cutting. My question is about a graph towards the beginning of the presentation that plotted landscape simplification against biocontrol. It had the Simpsons index against some metric of biocontrol on the y-axis. And what took me aback about that figure was that towards the upper end of the diversity, biocontrol was fairly even and high. Towards the lower end of diversity, though, there was a really wide range of biocontrol. And to the point made about microbial biocontrol, I wonder what the characteristics are that differentiate those high and low biocontrol sites, and again, what the context could be that might help us get better biocontrol in these low diversity landscapes. Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. It does appear to be a saturating function, as you indicated. We did do the statistics and couldn't prove that it wasn't. That linear explained as much as a saturating curve would. But I do believe it to be a saturating curve. If we had landscapes that were even higher in their diversity, I doubt that we would get, we can't get more and more pest control. My guess is about the cases where there's low landscape diversity, but still relatively high biocontrol. I might imagine that is sort of micro, not micro scale, but field scale interactions. Maybe you have alfalfa fields in a particular landscape. It's not particularly diverse, but that alfalfa field is known to harbor natural enemies at particular times of the year that can spill over into other crops. So my guess is we didn't have enough data to dig into that level, but if we were to, I would think it's going to be due to the individual configuration of the landscape. We were only looking at composition at that point and hadn't begun to dream about configuration. But my guess is that having the right shapes of fields, I took this slide out because I thought it was too far in the weeds, but it turns out that higher edge density in a landscape is pretty consistently related to higher pest control. Even if you don't change the crop diversity, if you just have them in strips with high edge density, you get much better pest control in that situation. So I'm guessing it's something related to that.
Okay, we have another question.
Oh, great, thank you. So my name is Janet Chen. I am a former science and technology policy fellow with AAAS and a former ecologist, now a career foreign affairs officer at the Department of State. But I wanted to ask you, kind of touching on this whole topic of industry and policy a little bit more. I get the idea that maybe you are mingling with some people in industry, particularly because you had the pictures of like the swarm robots and some other neat ideas there. If tomorrow you were to get a meeting with somebody in, I don't know, government, or let's do this, let's put more funding towards this, let's do a big project, who would be the people you would bring to the table? Who are the people in industry? Like, is there a particular state that's really leading the forefront of this kind of agricultural development?
Go for it, Doug.
I think that's a question for me, unfortunately. It's a great question. Who should be in the room? This is a bit of a diversion from where you are going, but whoever's in that room needs to recognize a fundamental fact that we're going to have a massive changeover in the demographics of who is doing farming in this country in the next 10 years. And so these technological advances, which maybe seem a stretch for the people who are currently managing those landscapes, are not going to be a stretch for their sons and daughters who are going to be managing those landscapes very quickly. So I don't have specific technologies that I'm prepared to call out, but I do think that bringing these types of ideas into the realm of the people who are going to be doing this farming, and very, very quickly, that is something that we need to recognize as a society. It's widely recognized in agriculture that our farming population is aging, but it's going to be a tsunami of change in the next 10 years, I think.
Okay, Linda, you want to?
I wanted to follow up on that and actually even pass it to Steve. So you talked about the challenge that the grower faces, and you asked the question about who should be at that table and the difficulty that the grower has to make a decision, and they've got their dealer, which sounds, their salesperson. But the reality is that the only place that discussion needs to happen? It's the PepsiCos and the General Mills and the Krafts. It's the buyers of these products. To what extent can either consumers pressure those companies, or those companies step forward and say, this is important to us and you will get a premium on your product? I mean, at some point, moving the needle up there, because the grower right now is taking all the risk, right? And at some point, that risk and reward, can we move that up the chain by consumer pressure or government pressure, or just have these companies say, it's going to be better for my bottom line?
Go for it, Steve.
Yes. So I want to be careful, because my intention isn't to be negative about any sector, but there are definitely the Cargills of the world that are wrestling with these issues. And Cheerios wants to say, Cheerios were produced, we made these from oat that we had monarch butterflies and we had good pest suppression, and so those values are important. And I think the problem is how to do it. And to me, and again, I'm not a sociologist, still playing on TV, but these scales of the farming community to the boardrooms is a challenge. It's how to get those people in the room and start coming up with some approaches or some ideas that could be tested then in different landscapes, different production systems. And maybe there's a role for USDA, EPA, Department of Interior to maybe help Department of Energy to help facilitate bringing in the socioeconomics and cultural anthropology into this. And then maybe we can figure out some paths forward. I mean, there's a sense of urgency, right? So sort of directed research, how do we bring the social scientists to bear on some of the natural science work we're doing? And then just to pick up one thing that Doug brought up, is like right now, Dan, I think and Lisa, 50% roughly of the land, agricultural land in Iowa is not farmed by the person that owns it. So you have non-operating landowners that are controlling probably 50% of the acres out there. And so that's a really important part of the population that needs to be at the table, because some of them don't even probably, some do, some don't. When you talk to farmers that are retired and now they're renting some land, if Doug said, hey, maybe we should think about trying to do some precision ag and increase profitability, there's probably a high likelihood you and I would agree, why don't we try it out, right? We both know farming, we both know each other, we trust each other, we try it out. But if that non-operating landowner is not even living in the state, they're removed from these decisions that are being made. So I think that's a really important other group, amorphous group, right, to be part of this conversation.
Sure. Yeah. So maybe I might just make one other small comment here, and this is, I think, something that comes up in the field that I work in a lot. And not to go too far afield of the question, but for example, who's in the room? Doug nicely presented his work that was done over a 15-year period. So there's long-term funds associated with that, and there's a call that you made too for evidence-based changes in the landscape. How do we know the things that we are doing in the landscape are actually beneficial for sustainability, for resilience of ecosystems, sustainable agriculture, et cetera? So maybe one of the groups, or some of the groups that need to be in the room are funders of scientific research that are helping us to pursue evidence-based strategies for designing landscapes by conducting research over long periods of time. So.
Yeah. I want to end with just a different take, and that is that we give farmers incentives from federal government programs all the time, especially for the big crops. Right, whether it's crop yield loss insurance, amounts and things like that. And the question is, how do you get those people in the room? Doug mentioned that agriculture is going to change a lot. We've had these kind of incentives there for a long time. We do have something for CRP land and things like that where there are some incentives, but can you build an incentive in for experimental agricultural use, right? I mean, can there be zones? And we've been talking about this quite a bit, where you try experimental agriculture. You have to figure out, of course, there's going to be loss in yield or something like that, at least temporarily. But can the federal government help in some of these things as well? So I want to move to our next question. Oh, I'm sorry. I keep looking. You put me facing this way. Now, how am I going to do this? Sorry. Please, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Jim Gaffney, I'm with USAID, and I've been there about 2 years now. Before that, I spent my entire career in industry with Pioneer Hybrid, which is now Corteva AgriScience. Before that, I grew up on a farm in southwest Minnesota, which is very intensely managed, monocultures, you name it. They are a little bit innovative in different ways. They use cover crop. They do have some pasture that's very diverse entomology-wise. So I want to make two quick comments, then a question for Dr. Kinkel. So first, Dr. Bradbury. So being in industry, we take this resistance management thing, it's not we anymore. Industry takes resistance management very seriously. And a combination of the EPA and the rules and regs that are in place and seeing what's happened in other parts of the world and in the US where resistance does happen pretty quickly, industry has the fear of God in it now. So they do follow the rules. They do try to create diversity. They do try to make sure that resistance doesn't continue. So I just put a little plug in there for for industry. They're trying, but they do need to keep the shareholders happy. And then a comment about what Dr. Landis mentioned about the next generation being a little bit more innovative. So my brother-in-law, who farms the ground now, I still talk to him and my sister, and I talk to them about management and what they're doing. He's not terribly interested, I don't think, in some of the things you've talked about today. My nephew, who is in his early 30s, is now starting to get into the farm, and he's eventually going to take over. Fingers crossed. It's going the right direction for him. He asked me tons of questions about this kind of stuff. So what you said is spot on. There's this next generation that's coming. Of course, they've got to make money, but they've got other ideas too. So finally, to my question, it's about soil health. It's for Dr. Kinkel. I look at what's going on in the U.S. Midwest. Yields keep on increasing. I keep hearing that soil health is going the other direction, but I have a hard time imagining that because yields keep going up and up. High yield environments are expanding. The soil on the home place where I grew up is in better shape today than it was when I was a kid farming. I don't know how to explain it, so go ahead. Maybe you can.
So I've got to confess, soil health is a completely fraught. I have to be very careful with apologies to soil scientists. I'm a microbial biologist of soil. I view soil health as a squishy, fraught concept, even though there are certain metrics of soil health. The ones that are robust and reproducible tend to be more the chemical metrics, but the biologicals, the microbes, right? That's such a core part of what makes a healthy, productive crop and what is a healthy soil, but perhaps one that can sustainably produce healthy, productive plants. What I can say is that we microbiologists are trying. The USDA, to its great credit, has funded some very large continental scale. I'm leading a microbiome effort on a continental scale project from Oregon to Maine, potato production across the entire northern tier of the US. And we're intensively studying microbiomes in replicated field plots across the entire continent and trying to get at least some understanding of what are the microbial correlates of what a grower might call soil health. We don't have the answers yet, but similar projects are happening in corn and wheat and soy. These types of data, which are not cheap, are going to be critical for us to really come up with any kind of answer to your question. So.
Please.
Thank you. Thanks for a wonderful discussion. Change the subject a little. At AAAS, we think a lot about the trust that is developed between scientists and communities. And Dr. Bradbury, you said something that really caught my attention, which is you said that solutions that are I'm paraphrasing, co-created by scientists and non-scientists, scientists and farmers, are really critical. Is there something that scientists in other fields can learn from you all, who are, you have a very close relationship, at least I'm taking that from your conversation, with farmers, with non-scientists, that is co-creation. Is there something that scientists outside of your fields can learn from you about this co-creation, about trust with communities?
It's a good question. I think part of it just boils down to taking the initiative to take a chance, taking the initiative to feel uncomfortable, taking the initiative to be in a room and looking around and going, I don't know what any of these people are talking about, but I sort of get it. So I think at the personal level, it's not being afraid to interact with people you haven't interacted before, not to be afraid to ask stupid questions because they're not stupid, right? And then I think interwoven in that with our organizations or our tribes or whatever is having leadership that supports that kind of interaction. Well, we've never talked to these folks before, but you're right, maybe we should talk to them. Maybe we can learn something. So I think it's at the individual level being willing to take kind of risk. I may look stupid, well, so what? Because lots of times if you just approach somebody and genuinely want to learn what they're up against, how how does the soybean, corn, how does this work? The fact that you're taking the time to try to find out what their world's like, you start to build trust to figure out if together we could build a different world.
I'll add just a little bit to that, is that there's a field that's emerged called responsible innovation, right? And that's much broader than just agriculture. And, the whole feeling about that, right, is that you do include stakeholders and those, being affected the most or the least, but it's a very difficult thing to figure out who gets the voice in these things. Because actually, as Dr. Bradbury said, people have different values. And so it's one thing to include everybody, but once you actually hear from everybody, then what do you do with that information? Who gets to do the decision making? So this is a very difficult thing to do, but I think people are moving forward and finding ways to do that better beyond agriculture. But in agriculture, we've been pressed on this, especially with genetically engineered crops, right? Because this issue of the way that genetically engineered crops were rolled out in the beginning, even I have colleagues who were at the former Monsanto, who would say, we realized afterwards that we didn't do it the right way. That whole idea that we're going to just roll this out, it's going to be good for the farmers, it's going to get out there, it's much better than insecticides, we see all the value for everybody and for the environment in doing it, and there really is a lot to be said for the value of it. But if you rolled it out without the public being behind you, you create a problem. And now that problem seems to have a shadow that impacts a lot of other things. So working our way out of that is really important. So with any new technology, getting ahead of that is so important, right? And I think that people are thinking about that more now than they had. And I think artificial intelligence is one of those pieces, right? So thanks for that question. Do we have some other questions, or have we used up our time? Okay.
Yes, so I think we are at time. So first off, thank you to our panel. A wonderful discussion, another great lecture. Thank you all so much. Thank you all for being here, and for all of you online for joining us. I do want to make a couple of special thank yous to the AAAS meeting staff who make all of this possible, as we couldn't do without them, and especially to Joanna Mello, who's on my team, who's I don't see her right now, all the way in the back there, who has carried almost all of the burden of making this lecture happen for the last several months. So you can thank her if you see her out in the reception. So thank you all for joining, and for those of us in the room, there's a reception outside, and please enjoy yourselves and continue the conversation. Thank you.